On a freezing December night in Springfield, a 12-year-old boy dug through restaurant garbage while wealthy patrons laughed at his desperation from across the street. But when the sleeve of his torn jacket revealed a delicate silver bracelet, one millionaire's cruel laughter died in his throat. That bracelet was identical to the one he had given to the only woman he'd ever truly loved 15 years ago. A woman who had vanished mysteriously after their forbidden affair, carrying secrets that could destroy everything he'd built. What this homeless child didn't know was that the jewelry around his wrist held the key to a devastating truth that would shatter two families, expose a web of lies that had festered for over a decade, and force a coward to face the most horrific consequence of his choices. As the boy walked away into the darkness, still wearing that fateful bracelet, neither he nor his biological father could imagine that their worlds were about to collide in the most heartbreaking way possible. This is a story about the price of abandoning love, the weight of secrets that refuse to stay buried, and the moment when a man's past comes to collect a debt that money can never repay. Follow our channel for more incredible true stories. Hit that like button if this grabbed your attention, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The bitter December wind cut through downtown Springfield like a blade, carrying the scent of snow and broken dreams. It was 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night, and Main Street lay deserted except for the warm glow spilling from Romano's Italian bistro, the kind of place where a single meal cost more than most families spent on groceries in a week. Behind the restaurant's gleaming windows, crystal glasses clinked in celebration, while outside, in the narrow alley that reeked of rotting vegetables and discarded hopes, 12-year-old Liam Matthews dug his thin arms deep into a dumpster. His fingers, purple from the cold, searched desperately through soggy cardboard and moldy scraps for anything that might quiet the gnawing hunger that had been his constant companion for the past 3 days. The boy's breath formed small clouds in the frigid air as he pulled out a half-eaten dinner roll, its edges green with mold. Without hesitation, he scraped off the worst parts with his fingernail and bit into it. The taste was bitter, nauseating, but his stomach had long since stopped being picky. Survival had taught him to swallow his pride along with whatever scraps he could find. From across the street, the restaurant's heavy oak doors swung open with a burst of warm air and laughter. Out stepped a group of well-dressed patrons, their cheeks flushed with expensive wine and their bellies full of $20 appetizers. Leading the group was Richard Callahan, a man whose net worth could feed every hungry child in Springfield for a decade. At 45, Richard commanded attention wherever he went. His charcoal Armani suit fit like it was sewn onto his body. His Italian leather shoes gleamed even under the dim streetlights, and his silver hair was styled in that effortless way that actually required an hour with the city's most expensive stylist. Everything about him screamed success, power, and the kind of confidence that came from never having to check a price tag. "Gentlemen," Richard's voice carried across the empty street as he adjusted his gold cufflinks. "Another successful evening. Jenkins, that merger proposal you mentioned, we'll discuss it over golf this weekend at the country club." His companions nodded eagerly, their laughter echoing off the brick buildings. But then Richard's gaze wandered across the street, and his expression shifted from satisfaction to something far more sinister. His piercing blue eyes locked onto the pitiful figure of Liam, who was now pulling what looked like a discarded sandwich from the depths of the dumpster. A slow, cruel smile spread across Richard's face. "Well, well," he said, his voice dripping with disdain as he nudged his friend Marcus with his elbow. "Would you look at that pathetic display? Marcus, you were just complaining about the homeless problem in this city. There's your proof, right there." The group turned to follow his gaze, their expressions a mixture of disgust and amusement. Richard's smile widened as he raised his voice, knowing his words would carry in the cold night air. "Hey kid," he called out, causing Liam to freeze mid-bite. "Is that your 5-star dining experience? Maybe next time try making a reservation. The men erupted in laughter, their voices harsh and mocking. Richard continued his performance, emboldened by his audience. "You know what they say. One man's trash is another man's treasure, though I'm not sure what kind of treasure you're hoping to find in there, son." Liam's face burned with shame and rage, but he didn't respond. He'd learned long ago that fighting back only made things worse. Instead, he lowered his head and continued searching through the garbage, trying to block out their cruel laughter. But then, something extraordinary happened. As Liam reached deeper into the dumpster, stretching for what appeared to be an untouched apple, his threadbare jacket sleeve rode up his thin arm. And there, catching the light from the street lamp like a beacon in the darkness, was a delicate silver bracelet. It was beautiful, too beautiful for a homeless child to possess. The silver links were intricately designed, each one shaped like a tiny rose, and in the center sat a small charm, a heart with two initials intertwined, RC and EM. Richard's laughter died in his throat. The color drained from his face so quickly that Marcus grabbed his arm in concern. "Rick, you okay, buddy? You look like you've seen a ghost." But Richard couldn't respond. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't do anything but stare at that impossible bracelet as memories crashed over him like a tsunami. Elizabeth. The name hit him like a physical blow. Elizabeth Morrison, the only woman who had ever made his heart skip a beat, the only person who had ever seen past his money to the man beneath. She had been his secretary 15 years ago, before his first marriage, before his empire, before he became the cold, calculating businessman who now stood frozen on a sidewalk in downtown Springfield. Their affair had been passionate, secret, and ultimately impossible. She was from the wrong side of town. He was engaged to a senator's daughter. Society dictated their roles, and Richard, coward that he was, had chosen his advantageous marriage over true love. Elizabeth had disappeared one night, leaving only a note saying she understood his choice and would never interfere with his life again. He had given her that bracelet during their last night together, had it custom-made, with their initials intertwined in the heart charm. "So you'll never forget that someone loved the real you," he had whispered as he clasped it around her wrist. And now, 13 years later, here it was on the arm of a homeless boy digging through trash, while Richard watched from across the street like a king surveying his kingdom. "Richard, seriously, what's wrong?" Marcus's voice seemed to come from very far away. Richard forced himself to take a breath, then another. He managed a weak smile and straightened his tie. "Nothing, just thought I recognized someone. Must be the wine playing tricks on me." But his eyes never left Liam, and the terrible possibility that was taking shape in his mind made his hands shake. The timing was right. Elizabeth had vanished 13 years ago. This boy looked to be 12. Maybe 13 years old, and he was wearing the bracelet Richard had given to the only woman he'd ever truly loved. As Liam finally found what he was looking for, a partially eaten hamburger that someone had thrown away, he stood up and began to walk away from the dumpster. Under the streetlight, Richard could see his face clearly for the first time. The boy had Elizabeth's eyes, dark brown, intelligent, with that same defiant spark that had first attracted Richard all those years ago. His nose, the shape of his mouth, even the way he carried himself despite his obvious poverty, it all screamed of Elizabeth's grace and strength. Richard's knees nearly buckled. "Gentlemen," he managed to say, his voice barely steady, "I just remembered I have an early meeting tomorrow. I should head home." His friends protested, wanting to continue the evening at another establishment, but Richard was already walking toward his silver BMW, his mind reeling with questions that he wasn't sure he was brave enough to answer. As he fumbled with his car keys, his hands still trembling, he looked back across the street one more time. Liam was walking away, disappearing into the shadows between two buildings. But the image was burned into Richard's retina. His biological son, if that's what the boy was, wearing the bracelet he'd given to the woman he'd abandoned, searching for food in garbage while Richard had just spent $400 on dinner he barely touched. The irony was devastating. For 13 years, he had convinced himself that he had made the right choice, that his successful marriage and business empire proved he had chosen wisely. But seeing that bracelet, seeing Elizabeth's eyes in the face of that desperate child, shattered every lie he'd told himself. As Richard sat in his luxury car, the heated leather seats warming his body while his soul felt frozen solid, one thought consumed him. If this boy was his son, and every fiber of his being screamed that he was, then Richard Callahan, the man who had everything money could buy, had just mocked and humiliated his own child. The engine purred to life, a sound that normally brought him satisfaction. Tonight it sounded like a death knell. As he drove away from downtown Springfield, leaving his son to face another night on the cold streets, Richard Callahan began to understand that some mistakes echo through generations, and some sins cannot be washed clean with money. In his rearview mirror, he watched the boy disappear completely into the darkness, that silver bracelet, the only proof that this nightmare was real. Richard's BMW glided through the empty streets of Willowbrook Estates, Springfield's most exclusive neighborhood, where manicured lawns stretched like green carpets and security cameras watched from behind wrought iron gates. But tonight, the familiar comfort of his sanctuary felt like a prison. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles had turned white, and his mind replayed the same horrifying scene over and over. That silver bracelet catching the light, Elizabeth's eyes staring back at him from the face of a child digging through garbage. The massive colonial house at 1247 Maple Ridge Drive stood before him like a monument to his success. 6 bedrooms, 4 bathrooms, a 3-car garage, and grounds that required a full-time landscaping crew. Every window glowed with warm light, a beacon of the perfect life he had built on the foundation of his carefully calculated choices. But as he pulled into the circular driveway, past the fountain that had cost more than most people's annual salary, Richard felt like he was approaching the gates of hell. "Focus," he whispered to himself, checking his reflection in the rearview mirror. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his face pale and drawn. Just act normal. Everything is normal. But his hands were still shaking as he walked up the marble steps to his front door, past the perfectly arranged Christmas wreaths that his wife Margaret had insisted on having professionally installed. The key felt foreign in his hand, and he fumbled with the lock for several seconds before managing to open the door. The warmth of the house hit him immediately, along with the scent of Margaret's expensive vanilla candles and the faint aroma of whatever elaborate dinner their live-in housekeeper Rosa had prepared. Classical music drifted from the living room, Vivaldi, Margaret's favorite, and he could hear the gentle clink of crystal glasses. "Richard, is that you, darling?" Margaret's voice floated from the living room, perfectly modulated as always. Even after 15 years of marriage, she never raised her voice, never lost her composure. It was one of the things that had made her the perfect political wife, when his father-in-law had been grooming Richard for a Senate run that never materialized. "Yes, I'm home," he called back, hanging his coat in the mahogany armoire by the entrance. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, hollow, distant. He found Margaret exactly where he expected, curled up on the ivory leather sofa in the living room, a crystal glass of her favorite Chardonnay in one hand, and the latest issue of Architectural Digest in the other. At 42, she was still stunning in that carefully maintained way that money could buy. Weekly facials, monthly spa treatments, a personal trainer who came to the house 3 times a week. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a perfect chignon, and she wore a cream-colored cashmere sweater that probably cost more than most people made in a month. "How was dinner with the boys?" she asked, without looking up from her magazine, her tone carrying that particular brand of disinterest that characterized most of their conversations these days. "Did you and Marcus finalize the Henderson acquisition?" Richard poured himself a scotch from the crystal decanter on the bar cart, his hand still trembling slightly. The amber liquid sloshed in the glass as he lifted it to his lips. Fine. Yes, everything went fine. Now Margaret did look up, her perfectly penciled eyebrows drawing together in the slightest frown. After 15 years of marriage, she had learned to read the subtle signs of his moods, even if she rarely acknowledged them directly. "You seem distracted. Is everything all right?" The question hung in the air between them like a loaded weapon. Richard stared at his wife, this woman who had shared his bed for 15 years, who had given him a daughter, who had stood by his side at countless charity galas and business functions, and realized he didn't know how to tell her that their entire life might be built on a lie. "Just tired," he said, taking another sip of scotch. The alcohol burned his throat, but it did nothing to warm the ice that had settled in his chest. Margaret studied him for a moment longer, then returned to her magazine with a slight shrug. It was a gesture that perfectly summarized their marriage. Polite interest, followed by elegant indifference. They had learned long ago not to dig too deeply into each other's inner lives. But then footsteps thundered down the grand staircase, and their 17-year-old daughter Sarah burst into the room like a whirlwind of teenage energy. She had inherited Margaret's blonde hair, but Richard's blue eyes, and at 17, she possessed that particular combination of intelligence and idealism that made her both his greatest pride and his biggest challenge. "Dad, you're home." "Ah," she said, bounding over to give him a hug. She smelled like the expensive perfume she'd started wearing and the faint scent of the art supplies she used in her studio upstairs. "How was your boring business dinner?" Richard hugged her back, and for a moment the warmth of his daughter's embrace pushed away the cold horror that had been consuming him. This was real. This love, this family he had built. Whatever mistakes he might have made in the past, whatever children he might have abandoned, this was what mattered now. "It was fine, sweetheart," he said, forcing a smile. "How was your evening? Get your college applications finished?" Now Sarah rolled her eyes in that way only teenagers could manage. "Dad, I told you, I'm not applying to business schools. I want to study social work, remember? I want to help people who actually need it." The words hit Richard like a physical blow. Social work. Helping people who need it. If only she knew that her own half-brother was sleeping on the streets while she lived in luxury, wanting for nothing. "Richard, we've discussed this," Margaret interjected, her voice taking on that particular tone she used when she wanted to end a conversation. "Sarah will major in something practical, business, or perhaps law like her grandfather." But Sarah wasn't backing down. "Mom, there are kids in this city who don't have enough to eat. Did you know that Springfield Elementary has a backpack program because so many children go hungry on weekends? While we're sitting here in our mansion, there are families living in their cars." Richard's glass slipped from his nerveless fingers, crashing to the hardwood floor and shattering into 1,000 pieces. The sound echoed through the room like a gunshot, and both Margaret and Sarah stared at him in shock. "Richard!" Margaret exclaimed, rising from the sofa. "What on earth?" But Richard couldn't speak. He could only stare at the broken glass, scattered across the floor like his carefully constructed life, while his daughter's words echoed in his mind. Kids who don't have enough to eat, families living in their cars. One child in particular, digging through garbage while wearing a bracelet that connected him to the love Richard had thrown away 15 years ago. "I'm sorry," he managed to whisper, kneeling to gather the larger pieces of glass. "I'm just tired. It's been a long day." Sarah knelt beside him, her face creased with concern. "Dad, are you okay? You seem really upset about something." As Richard looked into his daughter's worried eyes that were so much like his own, he realized that his carefully compartmentalized world was crumbling. For 15 years, he had convinced himself that his past was buried, that his choices had been justified, that the life he had built was worth the love he had sacrificed. But tonight, a homeless boy wearing Elizabeth's bracelet had shattered that illusion as completely as the crystal glass now scattered across his living room floor. The grandfather clock in Richard's study struck 3:47 a.m. its deep chimes echoing through the silence of the house like a funeral dirge. He sat hunched over his mahogany desk, surrounded by the trappings of his success, leather-bound law books, framed photographs with senators and governors, awards from the Chamber of Commerce, but none of it mattered now. His laptop screen glowed in the darkness, displaying a private investigator's website, the cursor blinking mockingly in the contact form he'd been staring at for the past 2 hours. Sleep had been impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that bracelet, those familiar brown eyes, the way the boy had carried himself with a dignity that poverty couldn't touch. Elizabeth's dignity, her strength, even in the face of impossible circumstances. Richard's fingers hovered over the keyboard, paralyzed by indecision. One phone call, one email, and he could have answers within 24 hours. But did he want those answers? Did he want to confirm what his heart already knew with devastating certainty? His phone buzzed on the desk, and he nearly jumped out of his skin. The caller ID showed Thompson Security, the firm that handled security for his company and occasionally performed more discreet services for his wealthy clients. Mr. Callahan? The voice belonged to Detective Jake Morrison, a former Springfield police officer who now ran private investigations for Thompson Security. The irony of the last name wasn't lost on Richard. Morrison, like Elizabeth. "I know it's late, sir, but I saw your missed call from earlier. Is everything all right?" Richard's mouth went dry. He had called Jake around midnight in a moment of desperate impulse, then hung up before leaving a message. "Jake, yes, I need a favor, something confidential." "Of course, sir. What can I do for you?" The words stuck in Richard's throat. Once he spoke them, there would be no going back. The comfortable lies he'd lived with for 15 years would crumble, and he'd be forced to face the truth about the child he may have abandoned. "There's a homeless boy," Richard finally whispered, his voice barely audible. "Maybe 12, 13 years old. I saw him downtown tonight near Romano's. I need to know everything about him. Who he is, where he comes from, how he ended up on the streets." "A homeless kid?" Jake's voice carried a note of surprise. Richard Callahan wasn't known for his charitable impulses. "Any particular reason, Mr. Callahan?" "Just call it a personal interest." "But Jake, this stays between us. Absolutely no one else can know I'm looking into this. Can you handle it?" "You know I can, sir. I'll start first thing in the morning. The kid have a name?" Richard closed his eyes, feeling like he was signing his own death warrant. "I don't know his name, but he was wearing a silver bracelet, delicate, with rose-shaped links and a heart charm in the center. That might help identify him." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "A silver bracelet. That's specific. I'll see what I can find." "Jake," Richard's voice cracked, "how quickly can you get me information?" "Give me 24 hours, sir. Maybe less if the kid's been in the system." After hanging up, Richard buried his face in his hands. What was he doing? What possible good could come from this investigation? But even as doubt consumed him, he knew he couldn't stop now. The image of that boy, his possible son, digging through garbage while Richard mocked him from across the street would haunt him for the rest of his life if he didn't act. Meanwhile, across town, in the maze of abandoned warehouses and makeshift shelters that comprise Springfield's hidden underbelly, Liam Matthews was experiencing his own sleepless night. He'd found refuge in an old cardboard box behind Salvatore's bakery, where the industrial ovens kept the alley marginally warmer than the street. The smell of tomorrow's bread wafted through the vents, a cruel reminder of everything he couldn't have. But it wasn't hunger keeping him awake. It was the memory of those men laughing at him, their voices cutting through the night air like knives. He'd endured worse, much worse, in his 12 years of life, but something about tonight felt different. The way the man in the expensive suit had looked at him, with that mixture of disgust and something else, something that felt almost like recognition. Liam pulled his threadbare jacket tighter around his thin shoulders and touched the bracelet on his wrist. It was the only thing of value he owned, the only connection to the mother who had loved him before the drugs took her away 3 years ago. She'd made him promise never to sell it, no matter how desperate things became. "This belonged to someone who loved me once," she'd whispered during one of her rare lucid moments near the end. "And someday, maybe it will help you understand who you really are." At the time, he'd thought she was just rambling, the way she often did when the withdrawal was bad. But now, touching the cool silver links in the darkness, he wondered if there was more to the story. His mother had been beautiful once. He remembered that much. She'd had secrets too, things she'd never talked about. Like why she'd never told him who his father was, or why she sometimes got that distant look in her eyes when she thought he wasn't watching. A rat scurried past his makeshift shelter, and Liam instinctively drew his legs up closer to his chest. This was his life now, hiding in alleys, fighting for scraps, invisible to everyone except when they wanted someone to mock or blame for the city's problems. But he'd survived this long by being smart, by being careful, by trusting no one. So why couldn't he shake the feeling that tonight had changed something, that the encounter with those laughing men outside the restaurant had set something in motion that he couldn't control? Back in Willowbrook Estates, Richard finally abandoned any pretense of sleep and made his way to the kitchen. The house felt different in the pre-dawn darkness, less like a home and more like a mausoleum of his carefully constructed life. He made coffee with hands that still trembled and stood at the window overlooking his perfectly manicured backyard. The pool was covered for winter, and the tennis court stood empty under the security lights. Everything was exactly as it should be, orderly, expensive, impressive. But for the first time in 15 years, Richard looked at his domain and saw it for what it really was: a gilded cage built on the bones of his abandoned conscience. His phone buzzed again, a text from Jake Morrison. "Already found something. Kid's name is Liam Matthews, calling you at 6 a.m. with full report." Richard's coffee mug slipped from his fingers, crashing to the marble floor in an explosion of ceramic and hot liquid. The sound seemed to echo through the house like a gunshot, and he heard Margaret stirring upstairs. Matthews. Not Morrison, not Callahan, Matthews. But even as relief began to flood through him, another text arrived. "Background check shows mother was Elizabeth Morrison, died 3 years ago, drug overdose. Kid's been on the streets ever since." This time, Richard didn't try to catch himself as he fell to his knees among the broken pieces of his coffee cup. Elizabeth Morrison. His Elizabeth. Dead for 3 years while he'd been living in luxury, never knowing, never caring enough to find out what had happened to the woman he'd claimed to love. And their son, because there was no doubt now, had been surviving on the streets, alone and abandoned, while Richard played the role of respectable businessman and family man. The terrible irony crashed over him like a tsunami. He had become exactly what he'd always feared his father would think of him: a man who could walk away from his responsibilities, who could prioritize comfort over conscience, who could let the people who loved him disappear into the darkness while he lived in the light. As dawn began to creep through the kitchen windows, Richard Callahan realized that the boy he'd mocked last night wasn't just some random homeless child. He was the living embodiment of every choice Richard had been too cowardly to make, every road he'd been too afraid to take, every truth he'd been too selfish to face. And now, it might be too late to change any of it. The harsh, fluorescent lights of St. Catherine's emergency shelter cast sickly shadows across the worn linoleum floor as Liam pushed through the heavy steel doors at exactly 6 p.m. The familiar assault on his senses hit him immediately. The overwhelming smell of industrial disinfectant mixed with unwashed bodies, the cacophony of coughing, arguments, and crying children, the oppressive heat that came from too many desperate people packed into too small a space. Sister Maria stood behind the intake desk, her weathered face creased with the kind of exhaustion that came from fighting an unwinnable war against human suffering. At 63, she had been running Saint Catherine's for over 2 decades, and the toll showed in every line around her kind brown eyes. When she saw Liam approach, her expression softened slightly, a rare show of personal warmth in a place that demanded professional distance. "Liam Matthews," she said, not needing to check her registry. "Bed 47 is available tonight, but you know the rules. No fighting, no stealing, lights out at 9 p.m. sharp." Liam nodded, clutching his meager possessions in a torn plastic grocery bag. The shelter was a last resort, a place he came only when the alternative was freezing to death on the street. The overcrowded dormitory was a breeding ground for violence, where the strong preyed on the weak, and trust was a luxury no one could afford. But tonight, after the humiliation outside Romano's restaurant and the strange encounter with those laughing businessmen, he needed the illusion of safety that 4 walls could provide. As he made his way through the maze of cots and makeshift personal spaces, Liam's fingers unconsciously traced the outline of the silver bracelet hidden beneath his jacket sleeve. The other residents barely glanced at him. A scrawny 12-year-old was hardly worth their attention, but he'd learned to make himself invisible anyway. Survival meant being forgettable, unremarkable, just another casualty of a system that had failed him completely. Meanwhile, 15 miles away in the marble-floored executive offices of Callahan Industries, Richard sat across from Jake Morrison in his corner office, the investigator's manila folder spread across the mahogany conference table like evidence at a murder trial. The morning sun streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, but the light felt harsh and unforgiving, illuminating truths that Richard would have preferred to keep buried in darkness. "Elizabeth Morrison," Jake began, his voice professionally neutral as he consulted his notes. 26 years old when she disappeared from Springfield in 2010. No forwarding address, no contact with family or friends. Like she just vanished into thin air. Richard's hands clenched involuntarily. He remembered that night, their last night together. Elizabeth had been crying, begging him to choose her over his engagement to Margaret. He'd been weak, torn between duty and desire, between the life his father expected him to live and the woman who made his heart race. In the end, cowardice had won. "She resurfaced in Detroit 3 years later," Jake continued, his tone growing heavier. "Waitressing at a truck stop diner, raising a boy on her own. That's when the drug use started, according to social services records. Prescription painkillers at first, then heroin when the pills became too expensive." Each word felt like a physical blow to Richard's chest. Elizabeth, his beautiful, intelligent Elizabeth, reduced to addiction and desperation, while he'd been building his empire and playing the perfect husband. The boy, Liam, was in and out of foster care from age 9 to 11. Multiple placements, none of them lasting more than a few months. The file indicates behavioral problems, fighting, running away, refusing to cooperate with social workers. Jake paused, studying Richard's increasingly pale face. Elizabeth died of an overdose in a Detroit hospital in 2021. The boy was found 3 days later, living alone in their apartment, trying to take care of his mother's body. Richard's vision blurred, and he gripped the edge of the table to steady himself. The image was too horrific to process. His son, barely 10 years old, alone with his mother's corpse, trying to understand why she wouldn't wake up. "After that, he disappeared from the system entirely," Jake continued relentlessly. "No trace until he showed up in Springfield 6 months ago. Best guess is he's been hitchhiking, riding freight trains, doing whatever it takes to survive. Kid's got more street smarts than most adults, from what I could gather." The folder contained photographs, surveillance images from traffic cameras, and security footage from various businesses around downtown Springfield. Richard studied them with morbid fascination, seeing Elizabeth's features clearly visible in the boy's face. The same defiant chin, the same intelligent eyes, even the same way of holding his head when he was thinking. There was no doubt. This was his son. "There's something else," Jake said quietly, sliding a photocopied document across the table. "Elizabeth's personal effects from the Detroit hospital. The inventory includes some interesting items. Richard's blood turned to ice as he read the list. Among Elizabeth's possessions had been a handwritten letter, sealed but never sent, addressed to Richard Callahan, Springfield. The hospital had kept it with her belongings, probably hoping a family member would eventually claim her effects. No one ever had. "I was able to track down the letter," Jake said, producing a yellowed envelope from his briefcase. "The Detroit PD released it to me after I explained I was investigating on behalf of a potential family member." Richard's hands shook as he took the letter. Elizabeth's handwriting was unmistakable. The same elegant script that had once written "I love you" on post-it notes left in his desk drawer 15 years ago. The envelope had been opened, probably by hospital staff, but the letter inside was perfectly preserved. With trembling fingers, he unfolded the single sheet of paper and began to read. "Richard, I know you'll probably never see this letter, and maybe that's for the best. I've started it 100 times over the years, but I never found the courage to send it. I'm dying now. The doctors say I have maybe a week left, and I need you to know about Liam. He's your son. I know you've probably guessed that by now, if you ever thought about me at all after I left Springfield. I never told him who his father was because I didn't want him to feel rejected the way I did. I told myself I was protecting him, but maybe I was just protecting myself from having to watch you choose your perfect life over us again. He's smart, Richard. So smart, it breaks my heart. He should be in honors classes, playing on soccer teams, worried about homework and first crushes. Instead, he's taking care of his junky mother and pretending he doesn't know I'm dying. I don't expect anything from you. I made my choices and I live with the consequences. But Liam didn't choose any of this. He deserves better than what I can give him. He deserves a father who won't be ashamed of him. The bracelet you gave me, I put it on his wrist before he was old enough to understand what it meant. Maybe someday it will lead him to you, or maybe it will just remind him that once someone loved him enough to give him something beautiful. I still love you, even after everything. I hope you're happy. Elizabeth." The letter fluttered from Richard's nerveless fingers to the conference table. In the margins, Jake had noted additional details from his investigation. Liam had been found unconscious from malnutrition 2 days after his mother's death, clutching that letter and refusing to let the paramedics take the bracelet off his wrist. Richard buried his face in his hands, overwhelmed by the magnitude of his failures. While he'd been complaining about stock prices and property taxes, his son had been living in hell, abandoned by everyone who should have protected him. Elizabeth had died alone and desperate, still loving the man who had destroyed her life through his cowardice. "Mr. Callahan," Jake said gently, "what do you want me to do with this information?" Richard looked up, his eyes red with unshed tears. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office, he could see the Springfield skyline, the city where his son was sleeping in a homeless shelter, where Elizabeth had once worked as his secretary, where 15 years ago he'd made the choice that had led to this moment. "Find him," Richard whispered. "Find my son." The autumn rain hammered against the cracked windows of Murphy's diner like bullets, each drop exploding against the glass with the violence of Richard's shattered composure. It was 2:30 p.m. on a Thursday, and the rundown establishment on the wrong side of Springfield's railroad tracks was nearly empty, except for a few truckers nursing black coffee and the ghosts of better times that seemed to haunt every vinyl booth and chrome fixture. Richard sat in the corner booth, his $5,000 Armani suit looking obscenely out of place among the torn upholstery and cigarette burns. His hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug filled with coffee that tasted like it had been brewing since the Clinton administration. But he barely noticed. His entire world had contracted to the sight of the boy sitting 3 tables away, methodically eating what appeared to be his first real meal in days. Liam Matthews, his son, sat hunched over a plate of meatloaf and mashed potatoes, his thin frame practically swimming in a donated jacket that was at least 2 sizes too large. Even from across the diner, Richard could see the silver bracelet catching the fluorescent light every time the boy raised his fork to his mouth. Elizabeth's bracelet. The last tangible connection between them, now wrapped around the wrist of the child, Richard had never known existed. It had taken Jake Morrison less than 6 hours to track Liam down. The private investigator had found him at the Methodist Church on Oak Street, where they served free lunch to anyone who needed it. No questions asked. One phone call and Richard had dropped everything, cancelled 3 important meetings, ignored 17 urgent emails, and driven across town in his BMW like a man possessed. But now that he was here, actually seeing his son in the flesh, Richard found himself paralyzed by the enormity of what he was about to do. How do you approach a child you've never met and explain that you're the father who abandoned him before he was born? How do you justify 15 years of luxury and comfort while that same child fought for survival in ways that would break most adults? The waitress, a tired-looking woman in her 50s with graying roots and kind eyes, approached Liam's table with a maternal gentleness that made Richard's chest ache. "You want some pie, honey? Apples fresh from this morning." Liam looked up from his plate, and Richard got his first clear view of the boy's face. The resemblance to Elizabeth was devastating. Those same dark eyes, the same stubborn set of his jaw, even the same way of tilting his head when considering a question. But there was something else there too, something that Richard recognized with a shock of paternal pride, his own intelligence, his own analytical nature, visible in the way Liam studied the waitress's face to determine if her offer was genuine charity or pity. "I don't have money for pie," Liam said quietly, his voice carrying a dignity that poverty hadn't been able to touch. "The lunch was already more than I can pay for." "Honey, did I ask you for money?" The waitress, her name tag read Dolores, smiled and ruffled his dark hair. "Sometimes good people deserve good things just for being good people. You want that pie or not?" Richard watched his son's face transform as he smiled, really smiled, for what might have been the first time in years. It was Elizabeth's smile, warm and genuine and capable of lighting up the darkest room. "Yes, ma'am, thank you." Dean, as Dolores bustled away to get the pie, Richard knew he couldn't wait any longer. His legs felt like lead as he stood up, his expensive shoes squeaking against the checkered linoleum floor. The distance between his booth and Liam's table felt like miles, each step bringing him closer to a confrontation that would change both their lives forever. Liam sensed his approach before Richard reached the table, that survival instinct that street kids developed looking up to assess this new potential threat. When their eyes met, father and son, stranger and blood, Richard felt the earth shift beneath his feet. "Mind if I sit?" Richard asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Liam's expression immediately became guarded, suspicious. He'd learned not to trust well-dressed strangers who approached him in public places. Nothing good ever came from those encounters. "It's a free country," he said carefully, not quite agreeing but not refusing either. Richard slid into the booth across from his son, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Up close, the boy looked even more fragile than he had from across the diner. His clothes were clean but worn threadbare. His dark hair needed cutting, and there were shadows under his eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights spent watching for danger. But it was the bracelet that drew Richard's attention like a magnet. The silver links had dulled slightly with age and wear, but he could still make out the intricate rose pattern he'd had custom-made all those years ago. The heart-shaped charm with their initials was partially hidden beneath Liam's sleeve, but Richard knew it was there. "That's a beautiful bracelet," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion he was struggling to control. Liam's hand instinctively moved to cover the jewelry, his body language screaming defensiveness. "It was my mother's." "Your mother had good taste." Richard paused, gathering courage for what he was about to say. "What was her name?" "Why do you want to know?" Liam's voice had hardened, and Richard could see the walls going up. This was a child who had learned that personal information was dangerous, that strangers who asked questions usually wanted something that would hurt him. Richard pulled out his wallet, and Liam tensed visibly, probably expecting either charity he was too proud to accept or something worse. But instead of money, Richard withdrew a faded photograph, the only picture he'd kept of Elizabeth, taken during one of their secret weekend getaways to a cabin in the mountains. She was laughing at something he'd said, her dark hair catching the sunlight, wearing the silver bracelet he'd given her just days before. He slid the photograph across the scratched Formica table and watched as Liam's face went white with shock. "Her name was Elizabeth Morrison," Richard said quietly, "and she was the most beautiful woman I ever knew." Liam's hands shook as he picked up the photograph, his eyes wide with disbelief and something that might have been hope. "How? How do you know my mother?" The question hung between them like a loaded gun. This was the moment of truth, the point of no return. Richard looked at his son, really looked at him, and saw Elizabeth's courage in the set of his shoulders, her determination in the way he held his head high, despite everything he'd endured. "Because," Richard said, his voice breaking, "I'm your father." The words hit Liam like a physical blow. The photograph fluttered from his fingers to the table, and his face cycled through a dozen emotions: shock, anger, disbelief, and finally, a rage so pure it took Richard's breath away. "You're lying." Liam's voice was barely audible, but it carried the force of years of abandonment and betrayal. "My father is dead. My mother told me he was dead." "Your mother told you what she thought would hurt you the least," Richard said gently. "She was trying to protect you from the truth about who I really am." "And who are you, really?" Liam's voice was getting louder now, drawing curious glances from the other diners. "Some rich guy who gets his kicks messing with homeless kids? Some sicko who—" "I'm the man who loved your mother and was too much of a coward to choose her over my comfortable life," Richard interrupted, his own voice rising with emotion. "I'm the man who let the best thing that ever happened to me walk away because I was afraid of what people would think. I'm the man who spent every day of the last 15 years regretting the biggest mistake I ever made." Liam stared at him for a long moment, his dark eyes searching Richard's face for any sign of deception. "Prove it," he said finally. "If you're really my father, prove it." Without hesitation, Richard reached across the table and gently pushed back Liam's sleeve, revealing the heart charm on the bracelet. With trembling fingers, he turned it over, showing the inscription on the back that only he and Elizabeth had known about. "Forever yours, R.C." "I had this made for her," Richard whispered, "the night before she left Springfield. I wanted her to have something to remember me by, even though I wasn't brave enough to give her what she really deserved." Liam jerked his hand away as if he'd been burned, his face contorting with an anguish that was devastating to witness. "You left us," he said, his voice cracking. "You left her to die alone while you lived in your mansion and laughed at hungry kids digging through garbage." The accusation hit Richard like a sledgehammer to the chest. "I didn't know." "You didn't want to know!" Liam shouted, finally losing control. "She loved you, even when she was dying, even when the drugs were eating her alive. She still talked about you like you were some kind of hero, and you were nothing. You were worse than nothing." The boy stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Stay away from me," he said, backing toward the door. "I don't need a father who's ashamed of me. I never did." "Liam, wait." But his son was already gone, disappearing into the rain like a ghost, leaving Richard alone with a cold cup of coffee and the weight of 15 years' worth of failures crushing down on his shoulders. The silence in the Callahan household felt like a living thing, pressing against the walls of the pristine living room where 3 people sat in various states of shock and betrayal. It was 9:47 p.m., and what should have been a peaceful Thursday evening had exploded into the kind of family crisis that destroyed marriages and shattered carefully constructed lives in a matter of minutes. Sarah Callahan sat curled in the corner of the ivory leather sofa, her knees drawn up to her chest, staring at her father with a mixture of disbelief and disgust that made Richard's chest feel like it was caving in. At 17, she possessed that particular brand of teenage idealism that made compromise feel like cowardice and hypocrisy unforgivable. Her blonde hair fell in waves around her face, but her blue eyes, his eyes, burned with an accusation that cut deeper than any knife. "A son," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the oppressive quiet. "You have another son. A homeless son who's been living on the streets while we've been complaining about the thread count on our Egyptian cotton sheets." Across the room, Margaret stood frozen by the mahogany bar cart, a crystal tumbler of gin and tonic suspended halfway to her lips. Her perfectly manicured fingers gripped the glass so tightly that her knuckles had gone white, and her face had taken on the porcelain mask-like quality it always assumed when she was processing information that threatened to destroy her carefully ordered world. Richard sat in his leather recliner, the same chair where he'd read bedtime stories to Sarah, where he'd celebrated business victories, where he'd spent countless evenings believing he was living the American dream. Now it felt like an electric chair, and the weight of his family's judgment was the current that would kill him. "How long have you known?" Margaret's voice was eerily calm, which was somehow more terrifying than if she'd been screaming. In 15 years of marriage, Richard had learned that his wife's quiet fury was infinitely more dangerous than her rare explosions of temper. "I found out 3 days ago," Richard said, his voice hoarse from the emotional confession he'd just finished delivering. "I hired a private investigator after I saw the boy downtown. He was wearing Elizabeth's bracelet, the one I gave her before she left Springfield." Elizabeth. Margaret spoke the name like it tasted bitter on her tongue. "The secretary, the one you told me was just a brief infatuation before we got married." Richard flinched at the words, remembering how he dismissed the love of his life as nothing more than a momentary lapse in judgment. The lie had been so easy to tell then, when Elizabeth was gone, and Margaret represented security, social status, and his father's approval. "She was more than that," he admitted, the truth scraping his throat raw. "She was everything to me, and I was too much of a coward to choose her." Sarah unfolded herself from the sofa with the fluid grace of youth and righteous anger. "So you let her go, and she had your baby alone? And then what? You just forgot about them? Went on with your perfect life like they never existed? I didn't know about the baby." "Bullshit!" Sarah's voice cracked like a whip across the living room, and Margaret actually stepped backward at the vehemence in her daughter's tone. "You didn't want to know. There's a difference, Dad. There's a huge fucking difference." "Sarah Elizabeth Callahan, watch your language," Margaret said automatically, but her heart wasn't in the rebuke. Her daughter's profanity was the least of their problems now. "My language," Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Mom, Dad just told us. He has a 12-year-old son who's been living on the streets, eating out of garbage cans, while we've been living like royalty, and you're worried about my language?" The accusation hung in the air between them like a toxic cloud. Richard looked at his daughter, really looked at her, and saw the moment when her image of him as a hero, as the strong father who could fix anything, crumbled into dust. It was like watching someone die. "What's his name?" Sarah asked, her voice suddenly quiet again. "Your son, my brother, what's his name?" "Liam," Richard whispered. "Liam Matthews." "Matthews, he has her last name." Margaret's observation was clinically delivered, but Richard could hear the pain underneath. "Not yours. She didn't even put your name on the birth certificate." "She was protecting him," Richard said, though the words felt hollow even to his own ears. "She knew I would never acknowledge him publicly. She was saving him from that rejection." "No," Sarah said, standing up and moving to the center of the room like a prosecutor addressing a jury. "She was protecting him from you, from us, from this." She gestured at the opulent surroundings. The Persian rugs, the crystal chandelier, the oil paintings that cost more than most people made in a year. "She knew you'd rather let your own child starve than risk your precious reputation." The truth of it hit Richard like a physical blow. Elizabeth had known him better than he'd known himself. She'd seen the weakness in him, the fundamental selfishness that would choose comfort over courage, status over love. And she'd been right. "I want to meet him," Sarah said suddenly, her voice gaining strength. "I want to meet my brother." "Sarah, no," Margaret started, but her daughter cut her off with a look that could have melted steel. "No what, Mom? No, we can't acknowledge the existence of a child who shares our DNA. No, we can't help a homeless kid who's been abandoned by everyone who should have protected him. What exactly are you saying no to?" No, Margaret's composure finally cracked, and tears began streaming down her perfectly made-up face. "I'm saying no to destroying our family. I'm saying no to losing everything we've built. Do you have any idea what this will do to your father's business? To our standing in the community? To your college prospects? I don't give a damn about any of that." Sarah's voice rose to a shout. "There's a 12-year-old boy out there who's probably hungry right now, who's probably cold and scared, and he's my brother. How is that not more important than what the country club thinks?" Richard watched his two worlds collide with devastating force. On one side stood Margaret, representing everything he'd chosen 15 years ago: security, respectability, the approval of Springfield's elite. On the other stood Sarah, embodying everything he'd failed to be: brave, principled, willing to sacrifice comfort for conscience. "Where is he now?" Sarah demanded, turning back to her father. "Where is Liam?" "I don't know," Richard admitted, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "He ran when I told him who I was, called me a coward, and said he never wanted to see me again." "Good for him," Sarah said fiercely. "At least one of your children has some backbone." The words hit Richard like a slap across the face. In that moment, he saw himself through his daughter's eyes, not as the successful businessman and devoted father he'd believed himself to be, but as a weak man who'd abandoned one child and failed another. Margaret set down her gin and tonic with shaking hands and walked to the window overlooking their manicured front lawn. 15 years, she said quietly. 15 years I've been married to a man who was in love with someone else. 15 years I've been living a lie. Margaret, don't! She held up a hand without turning around. Just don't. Not right now. The family portrait that had seemed so perfect just hours before lay in ruins around them. Richard looked at his wife's rigid posture by the window, at his daughter's accusatory stare, and realized that in trying to protect his comfortable life, he'd managed to destroy it anyway. "I'm going to find him," Sarah said suddenly, grabbing her jacket from the chair by the door. "I'm going to find Liam, and I'm going to tell him that at least one person in this family gives a damn about him." "Sarah, wait!" Richard stood up, but she was already halfway to the front door. "No, Dad, you had 15 years to do the right thing. Now it's my turn." The door slammed behind her with a finality that echoed through the house like a gunshot. Richard and Margaret stood in their empty living room, surrounded by the wreckage of their marriage and the weight of choices that could never be undone. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows of their perfect house and carrying with it the scent of an approaching storm. The abandoned warehouse district on the outskirts of Springfield looked like the skeleton of America's industrial dreams, its broken windows and rusted fire escapes creating jagged silhouettes against the storm-darkened sky. It was here, in this forgotten corner of the city where hope came to die, that Liam had learned to disappear when the world became too much to bear. The old Brennan Steel building had been empty for over a decade, its cavernous interior now home to pigeons, rats, and the occasional desperate soul seeking shelter from both the elements and society's judgment. Liam had discovered it 6 months ago, shortly after arriving in Springfield, and had claimed a small corner on the 3rd floor where a shaft of light from a broken skylight provided just enough illumination to read by during the day. Tonight, huddled in his makeshift nest of cardboard and stolen blankets, Liam stared at the photograph his father had given him at the diner. His hands shook, not from the cold that seeped through the warehouse's broken walls, but from the emotional earthquake that had been rattling his foundations for the past 4 hours. Elizabeth Morrison smiled up at him from the faded image, young and radiant and wearing the same silver bracelet that now felt like a chain around his wrist. She looked happy in the photo, genuinely happy in a way Liam could barely remember from his early childhood, before the drugs and the desperation had carved hollow spaces in her eyes. "Why didn't you tell me?" He whispered to her image, his voice echoing in the vast emptiness around him. "Why did you let me think he was dead?" But even as he asked the question, he knew the answer. His mother had been protecting him, just as she'd always tried to do, even when her addiction made protection impossible. She'd seen what kind of man Richard Callahan was, the kind who would choose comfort over courage, reputation over love. She'd spared Liam the pain of knowing his father was alive, but unwilling to claim him. The sound of footsteps on the rusted metal stairs made Liam freeze. Very few people knew about this place, and those who did were usually running from something themselves. He quickly stuffed the photograph into his jacket pocket and grabbed the broken piece of rebar he kept for protection. But the voice that called out from the darkness below wasn't threatening. It was young, female, and strangely familiar. "Liam? Liam Matthews? Are you up there?" He crept to the edge of the floor and peered down through the skeletal framework of the building. 3 stories below, a blonde girl about his age stood in the main entrance, her expensive jacket and designer jeans looking as out of place in the warehouse as a diamond in a coal mine. "Who wants to know?" Liam called down, still gripping the rebar. "My name is Sarah Callahan." She paused, and even from 3 floors up, Liam could hear the emotion in her voice. "I'm your sister." The words hit him like a physical blow. Sister. He dreamed of having siblings when he was younger, had fantasized about a family that would welcome him with open arms. But those dreams had died along with his mother, buried under the harsh reality of survival. "I don't have a sister," he called down, but his voice lacked conviction. "Yes, you do." Sarah moved further into the warehouse, her footsteps echoing through the cavernous space. "And I've been looking for you for 3 hours. Do you have any idea how many abandoned buildings there are in this city?" Despite everything, Liam felt a small smile tug at the corner of his mouth. "You counted them?" 17. "Well, 17 that I could find. I'm sure there are more." She paused at the bottom of the stairs, looking up through the maze of metal and shadows. "Can I come up? I promise I'm not here to drag you back to him. I wanted to meet you." Liam studied her from above. She looked like Richard, the same blonde hair, the same aristocratic features, but there was something in her posture, in the way she held herself, that reminded him of his mother. A strength that couldn't be bought or inherited, only earned through suffering. "Why?" he asked. "Because you're my brother," she said simply. "And because I've been privileged my entire life while you've been fighting just to survive. That's not fair, and I want to try to make it right." Slowly, carefully, Liam made his way down the stairs. Each step brought him closer to this girl who shared his DNA, but lived in a world so different from his that they might as well have been from different planets. When he reached the ground floor, they stood facing each other in the dim light, filtering through the broken windows. 2 children of the same father studying each other like cautious animals. Up close, the family resemblance was undeniable. Sarah had Richard's blue eyes, but they held a warmth and compassion that her father's lacked. Her clothes were expensive, probably worth more than Liam had ever owned in his entire life, but she wore them without pretension, as if money was simply a tool rather than an identity. "You look like her," Sarah said quietly, pulling out her phone and showing him a photograph she'd apparently found online. It was his mother, but younger, from her high school yearbook. "Your mother. I found this after Dad told us about you tonight." Liam's breath caught in his throat. He'd never seen his mother as a teenager, had no photographs from before the drugs stole her beauty and replaced it with hollow desperation. In the yearbook photo, Elizabeth Morrison looked hopeful, intelligent, full of dreams that the future had crushed. "She was beautiful," Sarah continued. "I can see why he fell in love with her. I can also see why she was too good for him." The unexpected criticism of their father caught Liam off guard. "I thought you'd defend him. Rich kids usually stick together." "Rich kids," Sarah repeated, and there was pain in her voice. "Is that what you think I am? Just some spoiled brat who doesn't understand real problems?" Liam studied her face and saw something he hadn't expected. Genuine hurt. "Aren't you?" "Maybe I was, before tonight. Before I found out that my father let his son live on the streets rather than risk his precious reputation." Sarah's voice gained strength as she spoke. "Before I realized that everything I thought I knew about him was a lie." She moved closer and Liam could see tears in her eyes. "I'm not here to make excuses for him, Liam. What he did, what he's still doing, is unforgivable. But you're not him. You're my brother, and that means something to me, even if it doesn't mean anything to him." Despite himself, despite all the walls he'd built around his heart, Liam felt something crack inside his chest. This girl, this privileged princess who should have looked down on him with disgust, was looking at him with acceptance, with something that might even be love. "I don't need charity," he said, but the words came out weaker than he'd intended. "Good, because I'm not offering any. I'm offering family. I'm offering a sister who gives a damn whether you live or die." Sarah's voice broke slightly. "I'm offering someone who wants to know who you are, what you dream about, what makes you laugh. Because for 17 years, I've been an only child, and finding out I have a brother, even like this, is the best thing that's happened to me in a long time." Liam stared at her. This girl who'd grown up with everything he'd never had, but who somehow understood the emptiness that money couldn't fill. "He'll never accept me," he said finally. "He made that clear today." "And then we'll accept each other," Sarah said fiercely. "And maybe, if we're lucky, we'll find a way to build something better than what he gave us." For the first time in 3 years, since the night he'd found his mother's body and realized he was completely alone in the world, Liam felt the faint stirring of hope. It was fragile, dangerous, the kind of hope that could destroy him if he let it grow too large. But as he looked at this girl, who'd searched 17 abandoned buildings to find him, who'd risked her safe, comfortable world to sit with him in a warehouse full of ghosts, he thought maybe it was worth the risk. "I don't even know how to be a brother," he admitted. Sarah smiled, and for the first time he could see past their father's features to something uniquely hers: warmth, courage, and an unshakable determination to do what was right. "Lucky for you, I don't know how to be a sister either. I guess we'll figure it out together." As thunder rumbled overhead and the first drops of rain began to fall through the broken skylight, Liam Matthews realized that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone as he'd thought. 6 months later, the Springfield Gazette's Sunday edition carried a story that would be talked about in coffee shops and country clubs for years to come. The headline read, "Local businessman establishes foundation for homeless youth. Program honors late Elizabeth Morrison." But the real story wasn't in the carefully crafted press release or the sanitized quotes from Richard Callahan. The real story was unfolding 3 blocks away from the newspaper's offices, in a small apartment above Mrs. Chen's flower shop, where the most unlikely family in Springfield was having Sunday breakfast. The morning light streamed through the gauze curtains of the modest 2-bedroom apartment, casting gentle shadows across the mismatched furniture and second-hand dishes that had become the foundation of Liam Matthews' new life. At 13, he'd celebrated his birthday 2 weeks ago with his first real cake in 4 years. He was still thin, but the hollow desperation had left his eyes, replaced by something that looked dangerously close to contentment. Mrs. Chen, the 72-year-old Chinese immigrant who had become his unlikely guardian, bustled around the tiny kitchen with the efficiency of someone who had spent decades making miracles out of meager resources. She had taken Liam in not out of pity, but out of recognition. She saw in his fierce independence and quiet dignity the same qualities that had helped her survive her own difficult journey to America 50 years earlier. "Eat more," she commanded in her heavily accented English, placing another stack of her famous pancakes on his plate. "You still too skinny? How you gonna grow strong if you don't eat?" Liam smiled, a real smile that transformed his entire face and made him look like the child he was finally allowed to be. "Mrs. Chen, I'm already eating more than I did in 3 years on the streets combined. Any more, and I won't fit through the door." "Good problem to have," she said with satisfaction, settling into her chair across from him with her own plate and a cup of tea that smelled like jasmine and home. The apartment was small but warm, filled with the kind of lived-in comfort that money couldn't buy. Mrs. Chen had lost her own grandson to leukemia 5 years earlier, and when Sarah Callahan had appeared in her flower shop 6 months ago, desperate and determined to help her newly discovered brother, the old woman had seen an opportunity for healing that would benefit them all. The arrangement was unconventional. Liam lived with Mrs. Chen during the week, attending Springfield Middle School and helping in the flower shop after classes. But weekends belonged to Sarah, who had fought epic battles with her parents to maintain a relationship with her brother, often choosing Liam's company over the social obligations of her privileged world. This morning was no different. Sarah burst through the apartment door at exactly 9 a.m., as she had every Sunday for the past 6 months, carrying a bag of groceries from the expensive market in her neighborhood and wearing the kind of genuine excitement that couldn't be faked. "Mrs. Chen Liam!" she called out, setting the groceries on the counter and kissing the elderly woman's cheek with the casual affection of someone who had been adopted into the family. "I brought those mangoes you like, and that expensive tea Dad complains about, but secretly drinks when he thinks no one's looking." The mention of their father brought a familiar tension to the air. Richard Callahan had tried, in his own inadequate way, to make amends. The foundation was real. It had already helped 17 homeless youth find housing and educational opportunities. He'd also set up a trust fund for Liam's education, had his lawyers quietly handle the guardianship arrangements with Mrs. Chen, and had even shown up at Liam's school play 3 weeks ago, sitting in the back row with tears streaming down his face. But money and good intentions couldn't erase 15 years of abandonment. Liam had accepted his father's attempts at restitution with the same polite distance he might show a well-meaning stranger. Richard was allowed to contribute to his son's life, but not to be part of it, a distinction that cut the older man deeply, but which he accepted as the price of his cowardice. "How is he?" Liam asked, as he did every Sunday, because despite everything, Richard was still his father. "Miserable," Sarah answered honestly, as she always did. "Mom's moved into the guest room permanently. They're talking about divorce, but quietly, because appearances matter more than happiness in our family." She paused, her expression softening. "He asks about you every day. Not in a pushy way, just he wants to know if you're okay." Liam nodded, processing this information as he always did, with the careful consideration of someone who had learned that forgiveness was a luxury he couldn't afford to give carelessly. "I got into Northwestern," Sarah announced suddenly, changing the subject with the skill of someone who had become an expert at navigating the emotional landmines of their fractured family. "Sarah, that's wonderful." Mrs. Chen clapped her hands together, her face lighting up with pride. "You gonna be doctor like you always wanted?" "Pre-med, yeah, with a double major in social work." Sarah looked at Liam, her expression serious. "I want to work with kids like you. Kids who fall through the cracks because the adults in their lives fail them." The weight of her words settled over the breakfast table. Sarah had changed in the 6 months since discovering her brother. The privileged teenager who had once cared only about college applications and weekend parties had evolved into a young woman with purpose, driven by the injustice of Liam's story and determined to prevent other children from experiencing the same abandonment. "You don't have to fix the world because of me," Liam said quietly. "I'm not trying to fix the world because of you," Sarah replied. "I'm trying to fix myself because of you. You made me realize that having everything doesn't mean anything if you're not willing to share it with people who need it." Mrs. Chen watched this exchange with the wisdom of someone who had seen enough of life to recognize transformation when it occurred. These two children, one born to privilege, one born to struggle, had found in each other what their father had been too cowardly to give: unconditional acceptance and fierce loyalty. As the morning stretched into afternoon, they fell into their comfortable Sunday routine, helping Mrs. Chen with the flower arrangements for Monday's deliveries, walking to the park where Liam was learning to play basketball with kids his own age, stopping by the library where Sarah helped him with his homework, and he showed her the books that had kept him sane during the darkest nights on the street. It wasn't the family any of them had planned, but it was the family they had chosen. And in a world where blood didn't always guarantee love, where money couldn't buy redemption, and where the sins of fathers cast long shadows over their children's lives, that choice felt like the most precious gift any of them had ever received. That evening, as Sarah prepared to return to her family's mansion in Willowbrook Estates, she hugged her brother with the fierce protectiveness that had become her trademark. "Same time next Sunday?" she asked, as she did every week. "Same time next Sunday," Liam confirmed, as he always did, and as she drove away, leaving him with Mrs. Chen in their small apartment above the flower shop, Liam touched the silver bracelet on his wrist, his mother's bracelet, his father's gift, his connection to a love story that had ended in tragedy, but had somehow impossibly given birth to hope. Sometimes the greatest price we pay for our mistakes isn't our own suffering, but watching the people we love learn to live without us. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, love finds a way to grow in the spaces our failures leave behind. The end. As we close this devastating tale of love, loss, and redemption, we're left with questions that cut to the very core of human nature. What would you have done in Richard's place 15 years ago? Chosen true love over social expectations, or taken the safe path that led to a lifetime of regret? And if you discovered you had abandoned a child who was suffering on the streets while you lived in luxury, could you find the courage to face that truth? Or would you turn away like so many do when confronted with their own moral failures? The silver bracelet that started this story became more than just jewelry. It became a symbol of how our choices echo through generations, how the love we abandon doesn't simply disappear, but transforms into something else entirely. Richard Callahan learned the hardest lesson of all, that sometimes the greatest punishment isn't losing what you have, but discovering you were never worthy of what you lost. Yet in the end, it was the next generation, Sarah and Liam, who proved that blood doesn't determine family, and that healing can grow in the spaces our failures leave behind. This story reminds us that every person we pass on the street has a story, and every choice we make ripples outward in ways we may never fully understand. If this tale moved you, please subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories that will challenge your heart and mind. Hit that like button and share this with someone who needs to remember that it's never too late to choose love over fear, courage over comfort.